Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much for inviting me. I have to say, so as Paul said, I live in Scotland because I did my PhD in St. Andrews, and my husband works at the university, so we're there. And I almost didn't make it to this conference because on the way to the airport, the taxi driver who was meant to take me, there were floods all over Scotland, and so his car got stuck in a flood, and I had to run to the bus station and find a different taxi driver. All of this to say, I'm very pleased to be in the warm and breezy place of Palm Beach, Florida, and I'm excited to speak with you all today. So today, I want to talk with you about how we can speak to people who want to believe in God, but find it difficult. I think that usually when we talk about apologetics, we have some kind of conversation partner in mind. And often that partner is a skeptic, right? They have all kinds of questions in mind. You need to convince them why they should care about religion. They're ready to go to a debate. But that's not the conversation partner I have in mind for today. The person I have in mind here is someone who finds God compelling. Maybe they even think that the Christian tradition is beautiful. They're the kind of person who, when they're on a trip in Europe and they see a church door kind of nudged open, they go inside, they look at the windows, maybe even they light a candle. But this person feels that they cannot, with integrity, commit to the Christian faith, even though they want to. Perhaps this person was once a believer and now finds it difficult to generate belief within themselves. Or perhaps they've always been pressed up against the window of belief with a little bit of envy and sadness, but a resignation that this religion, this Christianity thing, is not for them. I want to speak about how to talk to someone like this, because I think this comprises most of the people that we encounter and have conversations with in the world today. And I think it's encapsulated well by this opening line from Julian Barnes's book, Nothing to be Frightened of. He says, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him." When we look at the declining numbers of people of religious people in America, where it once used to be a mostly religious place, I think we need to know that most people have had some kind of experience, context, or even background in their family of belief, but they now feel alienated or different, separated from it. And I want to speak to this person because I want to suggest that this experience of wanting to believe but finding it difficult is something that is unique to the modern West. I believe there's been kind of a spell cast over us that makes it difficult to believe. Today, I want to explore the nature of that spell. Why is it so difficult for modern people to believe, even when they want to? And I want to suggest that imaginative literature can help us kind of break that spell, create cracks in the wall of secularity by creating the conditions in which it's easier to believe, where the person who wants to believe but can't might find consolation, reprieve, and even a way forward. So, if you're someone who usually deals in arguments, I do those as well. But I think that sometimes an argument can be best put through the form of a story, an image, or even music. So we'll be looking at that today. Let me start by giving a little bit of a history lesson and a part of what I think contributes to why it's so difficult to believe today. So this rather severe-looking fellow is Max Weber. He is known to be the father of sociology, right? So sociology being the distinctly modern discipline of kind of studying society and people and trends and kind of studying the groups of people. So when we think about something like Pew Research Center that tracks how many people believe, where their families came from, where the trends in religion are, that's kind of coming from sociology. And this guy largely started it. He's famous for writing a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It was not written in 1095, as this slide says, but in 1905. Apologies for the typo. And in this book, he describes kind of how we came from a world in which Christianity was the given, the thing that you just kind of fell into a world where it's one option amongst many. I really liked the way that you kind of that Paul described the world we are today, where belief is an option. And that's kind of the story he tells. So he says, how did we get from a medieval world in which everybody believed in Christianity to the world that we have today, where it's one option amongst many? And this he describes as the process of secularization. And in describing this, he has this word. Does anybody speak German in here? Do you want to yell that word for me? Beautiful. That was amazing. Thank you, and thank you for not making me say it. So this word could be translated in several different ways, which I'm sure you could contribute to this. How would you translate it? So, exactly. So a literal translation would be the demagification of the world, right? So it's making the world less magical. But it's usually just translated as disenchantment. Now, this is what Max Weber meant by this. He means that in the medieval world, we have kind of an enchanted mentality, and he means this in two ways. The first is that the kind of Catholic way of understanding the sacraments seems like magic to Max Weber. So he says you have a priest, he goes up, he says some words, the wine turns into blood. That sounds like magic, right? So that's the one way that he thinks it is an enchanted worldview. But the other way is that he says that medieval people understood themselves to be in a world that was populated by animate spiritual presences, right? So they think that there are angels and demons and saints that are just in their daily world. And this isn't something that they're like reasoning to. It's something that's a part of their immediate experience. And beyond that, they understand the physical world to be underpinned by kind of spiritual realities. So in these two ways, they said that the average medieval person believed in magic. Not in magic, but they experienced the world as a magical place. And secularization was the process of making that not the default condition. So that when you think about religion, you don't think about magic, you don't think the priest has the power to turn wine into blood, but you also don't experience the world as a place that is permeated with meaning, where there are divine and spiritual presences wherever you go, wherever you look. So this theory is picked up by lots of different people, this theory of secularization, and it's perhaps most famously picked up by a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor, who writes about it at length in a book called The Secular Age, which desperately, desperately needed an editor, but it does make some very good points. It's about this thick, if you haven't seen it. So he says this: new science gave a clear theoretical form to the idea of an immanent order which could be understood on its own without reference to interventions outside, even if we might reason from it to a creator, and even a benevolent creator. The life of the buffered individual, instrumentally effective in secular time, creates the practical context within which the self-sufficiency of this immanent realm could become a matter of experience. That is a very long run-on sentence, so let me kind of try to unpack it for us. So what he's saying is that with the rise of rationalism, the way that we think about the world says we're going to bracket out everything that is not purely provable in the material world, right? So it doesn't mean that the spiritual world doesn't exist, but we don't consider it as being worthy of being a part of our conversation. So we're just going to bracket out anything that is not existing in the material realm that we can touch and feel and measure. And he says that this isn't anti-Christian, right? We can still do science, we can look at things, we can measure things, and you could even say, look at the world, it's so beautifully and intricately made. There must be a God. But by kind of bracketing that out of philosophical conversations, it means that your experience comes to be shaped by this bracketing out, so that you understand yourself as also kind of bracketed off from the spiritual world that you exist in. So Max Weber was famously described himself as spiritually unmusical. And so he said, it's not that I have no problem with Christianity, and really in some ways, the kind of secularity had no problem with Christianity. It just regarded it as kind of a realm not to be touched or thought about. So what does it mean by a matter of experience? What do you see when you see this image? You see two stars. Yes. Does anybody know what the two stars are? Does anybody have a guess of when this picture was taken? This will show the real nerds, because a couple of you did get it right, but I'm curious if you know what it is. What was it? Did somebody say? It is winter, yeah. Does this give you any feelings? What's your general feeling about this image? What does it bring up for you? It's beauty. Mm-hmm. Pardon? Probably, yeah. How does it make you feel? Does it communicate anything to you? Calm. Yeah. Peaceful, calm. It's beautiful. Christmas. Why do you feel sad?
I saw these two stars this year during a tough time in life in January.
So it reminds you of something sad. A medieval person would have felt a portent of doom. This would have made them anxious. The reason being that it is the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, so the king planet and the war planet. And those two coming into conversation would have produced anxiety because they had this belief that the material world was permeated with God's presence, that it meant something. And in Scripture, even when you hear about the birth of Jesus, it talks about the star and what that communicated. And their belief in the world being permeated with meaning was to the extent that looking at these two stars and saying that Saturn, the war god, coming into conjunction with the king god, well, that's not a good sign, right? That's anxiety-inducing. We don't think that when we look at that, right? And that's what Taylor means by a matter of experience. It means that what we assume to be true about the world shapes how we inhabit it, what we expect of it, and how we interpret something like this. When I look at this, I feel small. I'm reminded of my insignificance in the grand scheme of the world. I think about the order of nature. To me, if it's spiritual because I reason to it a benevolent creator, right? But I would never just assume that the natural world in its own turnings would communicate something spiritual to me because I'm a disenchanted person who understands the world according to this kind of bracketing out of spirituality. So I want to say a few things about this to keep in mind. According to Taylor, disenchantment has kind of three impacts. One is it changes how we relate to the natural world. So it means that we relate to the world as a giant machine that is intricate and self-perpetuating. God might have created the machine, but the machine doesn't need God now, and the machine doesn't really communicate anything to us about God. This also means that we can use the machine to be the most efficient and productive that we can, which is largely how you see we live in a world that's so amazing technologically, right? We have medicines for almost everything. We've been talking about AI, which is terrifying, but it's also very, very impressive, right? And the context for that is created when you shift from looking at the stars and seeing, a portent of doom, to looking at the stars and trying to understand them mathematically and using that kind of attention to detail to create a world of technology. The other thing it does, secondly, so our attention to nature. Secondly, our understanding of ourself, right? So Taylor talks about the buffered self. So he means that in the olden days, you have this sense of being porous, right? Porous means like having like holes in it, like a sponge. That the world gets inside of me and I get inside of the world. That somehow stars could affect how I felt. And I think it's interesting that you see a kind of reemergence of that in popular culture with this fixation on astrology, right? But it wasn't really like that. It was more just the sense that the world itself is spiritual, even the material world. But in modernization, secularization, you have this turn inward to the individual who kind of understands spiritual things in terms of psychological language. And I'm not endorsing either of these views. I'm just talking about how Taylor describes it. And then the third thing is he says that you see a decline in religiosity precisely because religion becomes something that is optional, right? It's not something that we need to understand the natural world. It's not something we need to understand our own selves because we can kind of look within ourselves and find meaning. And so it becomes optional. So he says that this viewpoint and the kind of disenchantment is common to everyone in the modern West. And he describes this as being kind of the conditions of belief, right? So that if I'm going to believe, I believe it under the conditions that belief is an option rather than a given. And that my kind of viewpoint of the world in some ways runs against an easy believing in God, right? Because if I can believe in the world without looking to God as an explanation for the material world, if I can find meaning within myself because I am separate from the world, separate from my individual community, then the conditions for belief, that's not even talking about the arguments, right? What he's describing here is a matter of experience. It's how did the beliefs that change shape how we inhabited and experienced the world. And because of this, he says there will be people who feel bound to give up religious faith, even though they mourn its loss, right? And this is kind of where I get back this sense of, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. It's this sense that people want to believe in God, but they also want to have integrity. And their whole kind of experience is resistant to belief. But he also says that the flip side of this, and this is the but I miss him, is this idea of haunting. James K. Smith, in the book How Not to Be Secular, writes, almost as soon as unbelief becomes an option, unbelievers begin to have doubts, which is to say that they begin to wonder if there isn't something more. They worry about the shape of a world so flattened by disenchantment. This is St. Andrew's University. It's actually the cathedral, which is where I live. And it was destroyed during the Reformation. This is the horror kind of coming over it. And when I first moved there, I had this kind of persistent feeling of sadness because I could still see the cathedral. It was there. I could see it outside my front window. And there was a beauty to it, even though my primary experience of it was the remnants. And I think this is a lot of what we experience in the modern world. We can still see testimony to kind of a structure of belief that was quite impressive. Whether or not it was right, it was quite impressive, right? The medieval way of experiencing and understanding the world. But we now experience it as this kind of haunted place, this impressive but broken down structure of experience. So now that I've said a bit of the problem, right? So what I mean by the problem is that people experience the world in a way that doesn't necessarily involve God. And so that when we try to share the Christian faith with them, we're running against their natural experience because of what it's like to be a person in the modern and technological world. So what I want to think about today is how we can kind of create a crack in what Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame. So the way he describes this experience of being a modern person is the immanent frame. It's that our lives are encased in this frame of the immanent, right, which is that which I can touch and see. So part, I think, of sharing the gospel, making it compelling in the modern and secular world, is doing it in a way that helps people get outside of this experience of the world, that helps them, for a moment, believe in a world where things are permeated with meaning, where there is a structure and a personal nature to the world that we live in. Alison Milbank, in an article, in a book, actually, called Apologetics and Imagination, I think it's called that, I can show it to you afterwards, says the Christian faith offers a different way to understand the world, which discerns something valuable and mysterious in both the remarkable and the everyday aspects of life. People, things, and events are seen and accepted as a gift. They are recognized as possessing a depth that gestures to God. Literature and the visual arts can awake, not away, a new sensitivity to the splendor and strangeness of the world. So what I want to look at today is how can literature, the experience of reading, allow people to break out of the immanent frame and experience a world as permeated with meaning and order? And how can we use that experience as a way to talk about how it might be possible to move towards belief? And the way I want to talk about this is saying that literature can enrich the conditions of belief. So if you think about the conditions of belief for modern people, being that we understand ourselves as individuals, that we look at the world as a machine that doesn't necessarily communicate God, and that we see religion as an option, if those are the conditions of belief with which we're working, literature can help kind of nourish and change those conditions of belief by giving us different experiences. When it comes to Scripture, I think about this as the parable of the sower, right? The sower goes out, and we know this well, right? He casts the seed, and on one soil it's rocky, on one soil it's got what's the word I want? Weeds, and the other one it falls on well-nourished soil. Now, I used to read that and feel quite depressed, right? Because it just kind of seems like, well, I guess the ones that have rocky soil, that's that. Bummer for them. But I don't think that is what we're meant to understand from it, right? We're meant to understand that the seed, the gospel falling on our hearts, it will be received differently given the different conditions of our experience. And so part of what we can do when we're trying to understand and communicate the gospel effectively is to nourish the soil of our cultural hearts, right? It's to make it more possible for people to receive the gospel if they want to, and for that to take root. And so we're going to be looking at how literature might enable us to do that. And to do that, I'm going to talk about 2 books. And I must say this is a little bit indulgent because they're both just books that I really like. And so I want to talk to you about them because they help me believe, and I think they might help others as well. So this is a book, both of these books came out, I believe, in 2020, actually. The first one I want to talk to you about is Piranesi by Susanna Clark. Has anyone in here read Piranesi? I know at least a few of you have because I've made you. Oh, Matt, I can't believe you. Okay, shaking my head. All right, so this is a book called Piranesi by Susanna Clark. And it's not too long, so if you like short books, it's a good one to get into. And it tells a very strange, mysterious story. All right, it tells the story of, it's narrated by this man who writes in his journals, and he's called Piranesi as far as we know. And he lives in an immense house full of these kind of highly symbolic statues, which he understands to be kind of things that give him wisdom and meaning. And tides rush in and out of the house. And most of the book is taken up with his kind of beautiful, enchanted understanding of the world. He speaks of the house like a Christian would speak of God, right? The house created the world. He takes care of him. He understands himself to be loved by the house and understands himself in relationship to the way that the house created this world, and thinks of the house, this kind of God figure, as something that wants to display his beauty. So he spends his whole time writing in his journals, taking these intense notes about every aspect of the physical world as this kind of practice, both of science and of worship. And the author of the book did this actually to capture something like the enchanted worldview. So she's talking about Owen Barfield, who was one of the Inklings, one of the weirder ones. And I could talk a long time about that, but I will not get sidetracked. And this is what she says. One of Barfield's ideas was that people in the past related to the world in quite different ways than we do now. Ancient peoples did not feel alienated from their surroundings the way in which we sometimes do. They did not see the world as meaningless. They saw it as a great and sacred drama, right? If they looked at the Saturn and Jupiter, they would have been filled with fear, right? A sense that the whole world is orchestrated together, in which they took part. Barfield called this idea original participation. And I tried to describe this sort of relationship in Piranesi, who's the narrator's relationship to the house. So she's consciously using the narrator of this book to try to evoke what it would be like to experience the world in a way that you truly believed it to be a great and sacred drama in which you were a player. Now, I'm going to show kind of a contrast between the 2 main characters. The other thing I should say is that in this book, Piranesi thinks there's only one other living human being, and that's this character that he calls the other. And over the course of the book, you begin to kind of suspect that maybe Piranesi is being kept captive, and it creates this kind of anxiety because you really love, if you read it, please let me know what you think, but you love the way that Piranesi experiences the world. There's this innocence and this openness. It's like if a psalm came to life. But you also have the sense that he needs to escape and be safe. And you also know that for him to escape and be safe, he might lose that innocence. But that's an aside. So we have these 2 characters. The other is only the person in the house, and they are working together on this project. But a part of the way that the story helps us think through the kind of conditions of belief is it contrasts the other and Piranesi. So these are the kind of things I talked about, right? The natural world, the sense of self, and the religious orientation. And this is a contrast between how Piranesi experiences the world and the other. So Piranesi, who's the enchanted one, says of the natural world, "It is my belief that the world, or if you will, the house, since the 2 are all for practical purposes identical, wishes an inhabitant for itself to be a witness to its beauty and a recipient of its mercies." Right? So that's this very kind of religious intuition that God creates the world and delights that we inhabit it, right? It's like Eden. He creates the world and wants us to go all around and name all the creatures. And Piranesi experiences the world in this way. and also to be a recipient of its mercy. So there's always this kind of backdrop of grace, of God caring for us, whether in sin or outside of sin. In contrast to this, the other says of the natural world, there isn't anything powerful in it. There isn't even anything alive, just endless dreary rooms, all the same, full of decaying figures covered in things. He also says, someone says of him, the other is an egotist. He always thinks in terms of utility. He cannot imagine why anything should exist if he cannot make use of it. Right? And so that's that evocation of the modern way of seeing the world as this vast machine that we can tweak to get the most out of, rather than seeing the world as something that communicates divine meaning and order and relationship. Then we go to the sense of self. Piranesi, he's so precious and darling as a character, says, the world feels complete and whole, and I, its child, fit into it seamlessly. There's nowhere, any just juncture, where I ought to understand something, but I do not. So that's that sense of the porous self in which you understand you're not isolated, you're not internalized. You have the sense of belonging to the world belonging to you, and God taking care of you. In contrast to this, when we first meet the other, this is how we're introduced to him. Without looking up from his device, he says, I need some data. So even just that image, right, of the self turned in on itself, trying to figure out how it can maximize and use and understand something, in contrast to Piranesi's quite open, receptive, Edenic posture. And then finally, we have their kind of different religious orientations. Piranesi has this religious practice, he calls it that. It's kind of like almost a primal religious practice of, there are these bones that he's discovered, which is a part of the mystery. And he's collected them all in one place, and he goes and he brings them food and drink to honor their presence there. And because it's his only kind of companionship other than the other, who's obviously this very caustic, annoying person. In contrast to this, the other, who has this kind of goal to get some magical power of the house, doesn't want to, he feels like he needs to do a ritual, but he's so, like Weber, religiously unmusical, that he gets Piranesi to do it because he's too frightened. So in these two characters, we have this kind of contrast between the modern and the pre-modern way of experiencing the world. And Susanna Clark obviously wants us to experience it that way. And just to pause here and reflect on it, I think that this is helpful, right? Because it allows readers, when you're reading from Piranesi's perspective, you suspend your disbelief, and during the course of reading the book, you experience the world like the psalmist, right? You experience it as a place in which you can witness beauty and receive the mercy of God through the natural world. You experience it as a place where there's not disjuncture and internalization and isolation, but a place where you belong and can receive and be taught. And in being able to inhabit that perspective, you kind of try on a Christian worldview, right? And it's not as threatening because in the real world, if you're debating with someone and they say, well, I think this is kind of compelling, but I'm not quite convinced, you usually can't just kind of pretend to be a Christian for a day, right? But that's what this book allows. It allows you to, in the kind of safe confines of a book, experience what it's like to believe in God, to believe that he created the world to be a beautiful place, and to live in communion with other people. But one of the themes that runs throughout Piranesi also is this kind of fear that he needs to get out of the house, right, because he's in danger. Those piles of bones kind of indicate something has gone wrong. And over the course of the novel, he eventually does make it out of the house. But this brings up another important question, which I think can also speak to that experience of disenchantment, which is that the book kind of asks the question, let's say that there was this way of seeing the world. We can't see the world that way anymore, right? We live in a fallen world. We also live in a profoundly disillusioned world. And I think a lot of the reasons that people leave the church is because they have experienced something terrible there. And we don't want to admit it, but that is the case. And this is kind of the arc of Piranesi as well, right? You have this sense that once he escapes, will he ever be able to recover that sense of the world being beautiful after having experienced this great trauma? And I won't explain all of it to you because I want you to go read the book. But that is at the central question. And when Piranesi kind of emerges from this and he's reflecting on it, he's actually able to have compassion on the other. He thinks of one of the statues to describe him. He says, "I think of Dr. Ketterly," who turns out to be the other, "and an image rises up in my mind. It is the memory of a statue that stands in 19th Northwestern Hall. It is the statue of a man kneeling on a plinth. A sword lies at his side, its blade is broken into 5 pieces. Round about lie other broken pieces, the remains of a sphere. The man has used his sword to shatter the sphere, both because he wanted to understand it, but he finds that he has destroyed both the sphere and the sword. This puzzles him, but at the same time, a part of him refuses to accept the sphere is broken and worthless. He has picked up the fragments and stares at them in hope that they will eventually bring him new knowledge." So this is quite, to me, a poignant image, right? It's this picture of the modern person who thinks that the way you can understand the world is only by looking at material things. But if you do that, you bracket out most of what it is to be a human being, right? And most of what we know to be what brings us meaning and order and love. But because he's so committed to his own way of viewing the world, he just keeps smashing the sphere with his sword, hoping he'll be able to find something, breaking it into smaller pieces, kind of describing that experience of fracture in the modern world. But what Piranesi is able to achieve after experiencing this escape and this kind of trauma is something that the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur would call a second naivete. And this is the idea that it is possible, after experiencing doubt and questioning, to return to a posture where you find that your faith was in fact the case. And I think that one of the things that's powerful about Piranesi is that it shows 2 people inhabiting the same space and having 2 totally different experiences of it. And that reminds us that our view of the world is in fact a matter of experience, that there might be beauty and meaning there to be discovered that we aren't able to because of our perspective. And so almost miraculously, near the end of the book, Piranesi is still able to say, these are the closing words of the entire book, what he said all throughout the rest of it, which is the beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. This is kind of the almost prayer-like thing that he says to himself over and over again throughout the book when he's experiencing anxiety and fear. And so I think the book is powerful not only by evoking these experiences of enchantment and disenchantment, but also by evoking a narrative of someone who experiences something terrible, but is able to recover a kind of second naivete of belief after this broken experience. And for that reason, I think it can be quite powerful and quite cathartic. All right, now we're going to move on to my second example that I wanted to talk to you all about. Also came out in 2020 and is also narrated by an endearing character. This book, it takes place in a kind of ambiguous either present or near future, which is somewhat dystopian, but not really, because it's very close to our own experience. Has anyone read Clara in the Sun? Okay, a few more. It's narrated by a robot named Clara, who is solar-powered, and she is programmed to take care of students. Everyone works from home now, and so they create these robots that are created to take care of young people so they don't get lonely. So her whole worldview is oriented around the sun, which gives her nourishment, and around people and relationships. And throughout the course of this book, one of the ironies is that Clara is the most humane of all the characters, despite the fact that she is not human. And it brings up the question of what is a human? At one point during the course of the novel, someone asks her, "Clara, do you believe in the human heart? Something beyond what we can see and touch and feel." So it's really dealing with this idea of transhumanism. Now here we're going to see if technology is in our favor. I want to play you all a song to talk a little bit about technology, because I think that one of the primary ways, if we think about haunting and about that desire for something beyond the modern world, I think one of the primary places that we see people working that out is actually through technology and the desire to experience transcendence and closeness and intimacy through technology. Where are my IT guys? Up top. Can you play the video? Or the song? You could also look it up on Spotify. called the Hymn to the Axiom. This is an act of faith. I'm assuming that like God, they're listening, despite the fact that I hear nothing. How long shall I wait? So just to give you a little background on the song, if we're ever able to play it. This is by someone called Vienna Tang, who's an artist I really like, who worked in Silicon Valley in developing the technologies that we use now on things like Instagram and Twitter that generate ads to you based on your kind of experience online and what you click through on. I see a mouse. That's promising. We'll give it a couple seconds. I see faces as well. Has anyone else done a song or like a video? I'm being difficult. Okay, so we can't play the song. Okay, well, go listen to the song at some point after this. It's quite haunting, but you can see the opening lyrics here. Leave your life open. You don't have to. You don't have to. Leave your light open. You don't have to hide. Someone is gathering every crumb you drop, mindless decisions and moments you long forgot. Keep them all. So it's this kind of description. It goes on to talk about how it sees every moment in your life, how it knows what you want, knows when you're sad. I know in the talk we were just listening to, it talks about how technology keeps track of when you're prone to look at things and in what moods. So it talks about the kind of godlike knowledge of technology and how that kind of godlike knowledge can try to fix and fit into all of our needs, right? It can try to meet our spiritual desires basically by making money off of us, right? By keeping track of all of our moods and movements and then marketing us things. And the song is beautiful and slightly disturbing because it is an interesting mirror or parallel to God, who knows you, who knows when you get up and when you lie down, just like your phone does, if you keep it in your pocket all the time, who knows where you look to when you're sad, who knows what your comfort TV show is. And it speaks to that desire we have to be known, to be understood, and to have intimacy and closeness. And this relates to this movement called transhumanism. Does anybody know who this guy is? Do you want to see? Yes. And what is Brian Johnson doing? Yeah. Yes. And I believe that vial is his son's blood, right? So he's trying not to age. He's trying to live an eternal life. And he's doing this by what did you say? Yeah, by medicinally taking his son's own blood to try to regenerate his own DNA and stay young, which I think is personally just wouldn't do it. Aside from any ethical, obviously, there are various things we could deploy to say not to do that, but I just think it's also very weird, even if it were ethical. But basically, the idea behind transhumanism is the attempt to enhance the human condition through technology. And it's saying we think of technology as something which can address problems, right? It's kind of the full flourishing of that disenchanted worldview. That sense that whatever issue we have, the world is a machine, we can tweak it and we can find a solution to it. And I think that one of those things that we do is our own spiritual needs, right? We can kind of, whether we see that as spiritual needs for loneliness, right? So in Claire and the Sun, there's the sense that you've literally created a robot because human beings have forgotten how to connect, largely because of technology, right? So we kind of create problems that we then solve with technology. But it also could be health, right? So he's using this to fix himself and keep himself alive longer. But we can also talk about it with our spiritual desires. So one of the kind of goals of transhumanism is to have this kind of melding of humans and machines to where you become something greater than a human being. And that's often talked about in reference to this idea of theosis in Christianity, right? So in Christianity, we believe not only that our sins were forgiven, but that Christ in the incarnation was to draw us into the divine life, right? We're not just created to have our sins forgiven, but to share in life with God. And you see kind of a strange perversion of that in transhumanism that wants to have the human condition lifted beyond what it is into something with Christianity, with technology. So this is if you want to kind of have something that helps you think through questions of technology and theology, I would highly recommend this article in the Studies in Christian Ethics. But it says this: as opposed to a technological understanding of grace, so that would mean seeing grace as something where there's a problem and grace is fixing the problem, or even the whole enterprise of theology as some kind of problem-solving mechanism. A renewed teleological focus on elevating grace can remind us that as a supernatural gift from God, grace is in no danger of ever being replaced by human-made technologies, insofar as technologies remain natural human reason and proportionate to the limitations of natural human capacities. So what this is saying is that in a Christian worldview, even if you lived for 1,000 years and you took medicine that made you nicer to your spouse, and that made you never want to do anything problematic, that wouldn't actually be the end of humankind, right? Because what we're made is to share in divine joy with God forever. That is the final goal. That is what elevating grace brings us to. And so we can never actually achieve the fullness, the teleological end of humankind through technology, right? Because technology it's a gift that we experience in the world, but it's not actually something that can bring us beyond. And this, I think, is actually the kind of central question of Clara and the Sun. So I don't know if any of you have read any other Kazuo Ishiguro. He's the author of this book. Kazuo Ishiguro loves to stick the knife in and twist it. Have any of you read Ishiguro, like Remains of the Day, or... Okay, you should all read him. He's great, and also a Nobel Prize winner. But he loves to stick the knife in and twist it. He loves to kind of have that moment of disappointment. But one of the things that is really powerful to me about this book is it is about a lot of people who are experiencing a loss of relationship because of a technological world, a loss of meaning because a lot of the characters have been put out of the job by technology, and also the fear of death. There's kind of a central character who is very ill, and they're trying to figure out ways to possibly extend her life through technology. And what you expect in the course of this book is to have a moment either when someone has their mind uploaded into a robot, or to have someone, you'd have this damning moment where the beautiful perspective of Clara is destroyed. But throughout it, you have this strange experience where the robot is the one who relates to the sun, kind of like God. Again, it's very like Piranesi, speaks of the house. And she trusts that the sun will look after people. The sun will nourish and take care of people, right? And she has this very enchanted view of the world, that the sun nourishes us and looks after us, and even that the sun will nourish the child that she looks after and heal the child that she looks after. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but that simple, beautiful belief is never finally destroyed in the book. And she ends with this statement of, the sun was very kind to me. He was always kind to me from the very start. And it's an enigmatic book, but it is one that allows you to experience all these questions about what it is to be a human, if humans are different than machines, if human life should or can be ultimately extended through technology, and if we can find meaning through technology. It allows you to experience all of those things through the eyes of this character that keeps her eyes firmly fixed on this source of nourishment and light and order and beauty and goodness. And you come to the end of it feeling this kind of clean refreshment, this beauty, and this trust. And to me, this book is a much more powerful and compelling argument for humans being more than mere neurons and biological facts than I ever could really compellingly argue just through arguments. And I think that giving someone this experience of being able to inhabit a consciousness that sees the world that way, that experiences the world as pervaded by meaning and beauty, can be something that creates the grounds in which it's more possible to believe in what Christianity teaches, right? So if someone has been convinced of the arguments of Christianity, but has a hard time inhabiting what it's like to be a Christian, what it would be like to imagine a world that was pervaded by meaning, what it would be like to believe in a world where you could be guided by the Son, who is actually Christ. Also, there's a very Christological imagery in there that I don't want to tell you about, because you should read it. But that can actually create conditions in which it is easier to believe. And the reason that I'm quite passionate about this is that often, not often, but for a long time, I was the person I described in my opening of this talk. I was the person who deeply wanted to believe, and felt actually quite hurt that often people thought that maybe my struggles with my faith were because I wanted to go do something that Christianity told me not to, right? And that wasn't what it was. It was that I felt deeply within myself that I had a hard time generating belief within myself, and that I wouldn't have integrity being a Christian if I didn't give weightiness to that experience of doubt. But it was often, in important moments, having the experience of reading a novel or listening to music that made it feel like it was possible for me to believe. I needed arguments, I needed scripture. Most importantly, I needed to actually experience God in communion. But what I also needed were these moments of reprieve from the kind of relentless rationalism that we live in today. And so for me, in many important and serious ways, novels and music made it possible for me to believe in the world that is pervaded by meaning, and in a God who gives himself to us, both in the material world and also in Christ. So I'm thankful to you for letting me nerd out about these books that have been important to me. But I also hope that it will be useful to you when you're thinking about people and having conversations, to think about what can I do? What can I give them? Not just an argument, but in images and in music and in stories that can make it more possible to believe once I've received those arguments. And I would say that also the final thing is that if it is this kind of experiential knowledge, one of the most important things you can do is to just bring people to church, because that is where you experience God. So thank you, and I hope that now you can go out and look at the waves and also experience that belief that the Son was very kind to me. He was kind to me from the very start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joy. We've got about 10 minutes, so we'd love to just do a little time with questions.
Okay, so on the topic of the first book, considering the disenchantment and the demystification of really the modern West and kind of just being replaced with philosophic materialism, naturalism, rationalism. And so I don't think that we can kind of cover that topic without mentioning Orthodox Christianity, considering its big emphasis on Christian mysticism and sacraments, this 2,000-year-old ancient faith with an ancient worldview, which is a far cry from the modern Northwestern European Renaissance and Enlightenment Protestantism kind of worldview. So, like with you explaining how your faith wraps into this concept of a longing for a lost enchantment, so to speak. Like, what do you personally think of Eastern Orthodox Christianity?
Thank you for that question. I have great respect for Eastern Orthodoxy, and am very nourished by a lot of its philosophical and church tradition. I do still think that, at least anywhere we are, like in the States, I think you're still going to have that experience of living in the modern world, even if you're in Eastern Orthodoxy, because the kind of way that society and schools and everything else that we experience is set up is just in the modern West. And I think that you even see kind of sad, to me at least, sometimes representations of the ways that various churches can be driven by kind of identity politics and things like that, even sometimes almost especially in Orthodoxy because it's so connected to national identities. But I think that's an outworking of we're all still working in the same experience of the world on some level. However, I do think that the liturgical and aesthetic and musical and theological resources you have there are much richer, maybe sometimes, than some of the other traditions you mentioned. Is that satisfactory? Definitely. Yeah, and I mean, if you wanted people, so I would think of people like Alexander Schmemann or John Baer, people like that are great theological resources from the Orthodox tradition who help kind of open that up.
Thank you, Joy, for that excellent presentation. Same question I asked Sarah Stevenson yesterday about are there TV shows or movies that you think are great examples of inviting people to re-enchant the way that they see the world?
Okay, the first one I have is I want to give the warning that it's like it's a slightly disturbing thing. The show Barry on HBO. Has anyone watched it? Okay, one person. It's a kind of strange show, but for me, it's about a ex military man who becomes a hitman, but then accidentally joins a improv workshop, and which is a weird setup. But it's about kind of, to me, it looks at human beings and their capacity for choice and their need for each other, and provokes in me like a renewed sense of how significant that is and how spiritual it is. And kind of through some of its disturbing elements actually makes strange is kind of one of the words that Alison Milbank does, makes you realize the strangeness of being a human being in a way that I find really compelling. But it is quite violent.
Thank you so much for being here and speaking on this. This is something that I've always felt really passionate about. Something that I've found compelling outside of Scripture for the existence of God is poetry. I'm a little surprised that you didn't mention it at all. In your walk with the Lord, was there any poetic verse or anything like that that was highly compelling to you, or anything that you would suggest to others?
I definitely love poetry. I think I was thinking of that being under the large umbrella of literary art. A poem I really love, this is kind of I'm just telling you a poem that I like, but is the poem The Singing Bowl by Malcolm Guite. And it's about kind of the experience of slowing down and tending to the everyday and finding God's presence in it. So I found that very helpful.
You spoke about people thinking that you wanted to believe, but you weren't sure if you wanted to believe. Were you the first Christian in your family, or did you grow up in a Christian home? Because I was the first Christian in my family, and so was my husband. So the faith became very much ours before my sister, before my mom, and so on.
Did you find that people found your belief difficult to understand?
At one point, my dad did. Even though he never attended church, they sent us, when we were little, they sent us to Catholic church. But when I found Jesus on my own in college, in a secular college, I found Jesus in college as opposed to losing Jesus in college. So in a secular university, University of Miami, and so one day he and I sat down and he just said to me, I cannot believe that you left the Catholic Church. And if it hadn't been because I really respected him and I know how much he cared for us, I would have, I think, laughed in his face, because he never wanted. He always criticized everybody that was a pastor or a priest or anything like that. So he didn't look to me like he cared that much.
I come from a very loving, very Christian family. And which is why kind of my long experience of doubt and questioning was in a weird way particularly painful, because I really loved my experience of growing up in a Christian family. And so I think I think my family was very understanding of kind of the wrestling, but it was more sometimes the conversations I would have in church that were quite difficult, because I was trying my hardest to stay in church, but finding it difficult. And I think it's just because sometimes people find questions frightening. And I also don't think that everyone experiences like doubts or questioning in the same way. So some people experience it more as an anxiety-inducing thing than others. And some people can go their whole lives and never experience much doubt, and I don't think that's a bad thing either. So, anyway.
Can we thank Dr. Clarkson for her time today? Thank you.